because I said I watch a lot of Russian state TV because I believe in the value in they say know thine enemy. Russia isn't my enemy. I love Russia. I studied there. I speak Russian. I love Russian literature. I have tons of Russian friends. I think the Russian people are tremendously intelligent and educated and cultured. I am not a Russia basher. And when I bash Russian disinformation, when I bash Putin, I'm not going out on some emotional limb here. I am doing it precisely because I believe that what Putin is doing goes against the grain of everything that I believe is richest about Russia. He is destroying the kernel of what makes Russia such an attractive place in so many ways. But it has this congenital defect and it keeps going back to it. And Putin is right now bringing it into a very dark period. This is the opening, and I'll explain to you after. It is in Russian. I'll explain to you after something. I just want you to watch the first minute of last night's 9 p.m. This is the main nightly news broadcast on Russia's state TV channel called Vremya. Vremya was also, in Soviet times, the main news channel that every Russian gathered around the TV. You watched Vremya. It was the conduit for your news. It was the reality as it exists in the world. So watch this.
Здравствуйте, в эфире программа «Время», в студии Екатерина Андреева. Главные события дня. Которыми гордится страна: наука, промышленность, культура, спорт. Владимир Путин на ВДНХ на грандиозной выставке «Россия». Многодетная мама и экоактивист из Воронежа Наталья Аминева стала волонтером года. Награду на форуме «Мы вместе» вручил президент. Вскрыли оборону противника, подавили огневые точки и освободили пригород Артемовска. Минобороны опубликовала кадры штурма поселка в Донецкой Народной Республике. С учетом интересов друг друга Владимир Путин о принципах многополярного мира и активности России в международных делах. Встреча в Кремле с новыми послами иностранных государств.
Did any of you notice something about that? What strikes you right away? There were 4 headlines I showed. There's 8 altogether there, but I showed 4. The battle for Donbass is absolutely a main theme. The Russians, on Russian state TV, you never ever hear about setbacks on the battlefield, with extreme rare exception up against Ukrainian forces. You know, when they were routed from Kherson last autumn, you don't hear about that. What is always happening on Russian state TV in the world, it's like Barbie world. In Russian state TV, what is always happening is the Russians are liberating villages in either the Donetsk People's Republic or its twin sister, the Luhansk People's Republic, liberating them from not just anyone, from neo-Nazis. Now they've used the word Nazi a little bit less in recent months on Russian state TV than they did in the beginning, where anyone really who was fighting the Russians, and especially the Ukrainians, were Nazis or neo-Nazis. So that is definitely a theme you will see every night. Some form of a battle in Donbass, which is officially what Putin is going for. Officially, the special military operation, remember, it's not a war, the special military operation is fighting to liberate the Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine from the neo-Nazis who are out to get them. With parallels, by the way, I will note, with often on the nightly news, parallels in reports and footage going back to World War II, the great victory of Stalin and the Soviets over the Nazis. Putin is drawing a direct parallel today in his narrative, which is also the narrative, obviously, of state TV, that this is a victory, modern day equivalent of the cause of the Soviets crushing the Nazis. And the Victory Day parade, by the way, for what it's worth, May 9th in Russia right now, Victory Day has been sort of redefined under Putin as a day in which a great ultra-nationalist celebration, great celebration with also the connotations of the war in Ukraine here, that we will also win this victory. The great Russian people will once again triumph as they did in World War II. So absolutely, bitva, by the way, the word in Russian that they used was bitva, which literally means battle, the battle for Donbass. But the other thing that struck me, and you probably noticed it, but maybe it's just so obvious that it's not even worth commenting on, is 3 of those 4 headlines were Putin, Putin, Putin. Okay, Putin, Putin, Putin. One of them was Putin at an exhibition in a place in Moscow called Vedenha. Vedenha during the Soviet Union was an exhibition grounds, which was a showcase of the achievements of Soviet labor and all of the Soviet republics. So you'd have the best cows in the Soviet Union on display there, or the best pigs. The best workers would come with their crafts and their tractors. It was supposed to really showcase, like I said, the achievements, the successes of Soviet man, the new man going towards a radiant future. Vedenha has now taken on a sinister new meaning, sort of with echoes of its Soviet meaning. For many years, by the way, it was no longer an exhibition center. It was just sort of like they had shopping and shops and malls and car dealerships and stuff like that. But it's now back to its sort of Soviet purpose, which is to showcase achievements. So Putin was shown there, the top of the news, showcasing achievements. The last one here is that Dobro Pожаловать means welcome in Russian. It says Dobro Pожаловать. And what Putin, by the way, slightly grandiose setting, I would say. You also, very often on state TV, you see Putin, it's almost like a staging of Putin. You don't just see Putin sort of hanging out in some sort of, laid back, casual way. He is always surrounded by the trappings of some grandiose, like Tsarist era magnificence, this power, something that evokes the past glory and resplendence of Russian Empire. He's often alone, Putin the man who is sort of single-handedly holding up empire. And he's always supposed to sort of be in contrast to everyone else. He stands alone as the man rescuing Russia. What he's doing here is he was welcoming new ambassadors to Russia, as you do, a lot of leaders do that. You have new ambassadors sworn in, except this had a political message too. The story is basically telling them about how frustrated he is with the state of relations between Russia and their countries, and calling out certain ambassadors by name. Usually it's just a formality, you greet the ambassadors, you shake their hands, you say, welcome, good luck in your work, I hope to have a constructive relationship with you. He called out the Swedish ambassador because Sweden, as you know, is about to join NATO. He called out the British ambassador saying, you've made our relations the worst they've been since the Cold War. He called out, I think, the German ambassador as well for doing too much, sending all those weapons to Kiev. So singling each of them out, but it's basically like they're almost like these are foreign ambassadors, representatives of their country in the Kremlin being sworn in by Putin, welcomed to a new role. And he's treating them sort of like school kids, like a headmaster chewing out unruly school children. It's quite astonishing. And this is in succession. So any story not only showcases and puts Putin front and center as your man who has your back, saying to tens of millions of Russians watching it, Putin has your back. Putin is showing those big, bad, decadent, lazy, weak, morally insufficient Westerners just who has, who has the right way and who's going to ultimately win. So it's fascinating to me. And this is, by the way, just about every night. This is not, I didn't have to cherry pick this. I didn't watch 20 nights and say, I'll choose this night. Basically, I could have gone 2 nights ago and showed you about the same thing, 3 nights ago about the same thing. Like I said, mostly an older demographic. When I say older, not actually that old. I'm talking about 50, 55 years and older Russians watch the Russian state TV pretty religiously. And that's really where they get the news. Now, their kids and the internet savvy generation, yes, in the big cities, sure, they have firewalls, they have VPN, they could get over firewalls, they have VPN, they're able to access, obviously, Western sources of information, but it is getting more and more difficult. And more Russians than you can really suspect, beyond the big cities and across many parts of Russia, are still locked within an informational prism, partly of their own choosing, because they don't make an effort to try to find ways to seek out alternative information, but just because also out of habit. That's what they're used to. These are not bad people. These are not people who want to necessarily embrace the state lies. This is what they know. This is the narrative that they've grown up with. And in question and answer time, I might have some, I don't want to do it now, but I could tell you a little bit more about Russian public opinion and how they actually take it and what people really think about this propaganda, how many diehard, hardcore believers there are, how many people are sort of just play acting, how many people don't believe it at all, but out of fear sort of buy into it. Now, last March, actually in March 2022, for a very brief moment, unprecedented in modern Russia, a very, very, very brief moment, the matrix was broken. Someone burst out of this alternate reality. Someone broke the telescreen, if you will. And those tens of millions of Russians sitting in their living rooms across Russia for 10 seconds saw this.
Российский премьер подчеркнул, надо усилить сотрудничество в рамках союзного государства, а на совещании в правительстве обсуждали, как сохранить доступность лекарств.
Okay, you see that? You see how long did that last? About 10 seconds? 10 seconds. 10 seconds of reality. That woman there holding up the sign, she did become an international cause célèbre. A lot of you probably have heard of her. Her name is Marina Ovsyannikova. She is now, thanks to Reporters Without Borders, she is now living in France. She's out of harm's way. What she did, Marina Ovsyannikova had been working for over a decade at Первый канал, at Russia's first channel, the biggest state channel. She had been a chief editor, and as one of the chief editors working in the production room, Ovsyannikova had access to something that almost no Russians have access to. I told you a few minutes ago that there's no such thing as real journalism in state TV. State TV is basically you're a short order cook cooking up dishes for the Kremlin agenda. And you're cherry picking certain images which are going to present the story in exactly the way the Kremlin needs that story to be presented. Any image, it's not about seeking some truth. It's not about investigative journalism. It's not about getting to the facts behind a story. It's about presenting the story in a way that will already corroborate the narrative that is presented on their menu to the editors. So Marina Ovsyannikova sat in her gallery day after day after day after day, and she had before her a whole panel of screens. She had images from Reuters, from Associated Press. She had CNN, she had BBC, probably had CBC. But the bottom line is she had access to all of the images of Western information that regular Russians do not have access to. And her job was to basically cut and slice for the reports to present the images in a way that will corroborate the Kremlin narrative. And one day, she got sick of it. She didn't know actually until the last minute that she was going to be able to do this. I've been to the studios of Первый канал, First Channel. I've never seen such tight security. It was housed before in a building called Ostankino. It's a big TV tower in Moscow. It has security like Fort Knox. I mean, it is several perimeters of security. Forget getting into the studio. I mean, getting into the studio, you have to go through so many cordons of security. It's ridiculous. She was only able to do this, because she had been there so long and she was trusted. She knew the way around. She knew the security guards. They knew her. That poster you could see is bent at the edges. That's because she didn't carry the poster from her office, from her production gallery onto the set. She basically had to roll it up and unfurl the banner quickly just as she ran onto air. She literally ran on. It was almost like a kamikaze thing that she did. Because it was so public, because her protest, no war, stop the war, don't believe the propaganda, they're lying to you. Because it was picked up as an international story, they couldn't or they didn't immediately arrest her. But she staged another protest. And this protest was right after Russia had passed a law making it punishable for up to 15 years in prison for defaming the Russian military forces, for spreading false information, as the Russians see it, about Russia's special military operation, discrediting the Russian army. It became punishable by up to 15 years in prison. And she was put under house arrest as a result of a second protest she did, and she was summoned to a Moscow court. 9 days after that. She never got to that court appearance because she got out. She escaped. She escaped by literally trudging through a forest in thick mud at night. She has testified since then. She never thought she'd make it out. But this gives you a sense of how hard it is, how extremely difficult it is to break through that matrix. The woman sitting in front of her is Yekaterina Andreevna, and she has been working with the First Channel. She's their main presenter, their nightly news presenter. She's been working with that channel for over 20 years. And Ovsyannikova knew her well, obviously, and said now that she's one of these people she's been so steeped in it that she doesn't even think she's cynical about it. She thinks that she's drunk the Kool-Aid, in a sense, that she actually buys into everything she says. She's not a journalist. She is a news reader, but a reader of news served to her on a platter. Served to her on a platter by editors who are taking their orders from the Kremlin, essentially. And like I said, no, there's not a red line to the Kremlin, although, yeah, there probably is something for certain stories. But there are clear orders when big news events happen. What words can and cannot be used, how news stories can be presented. And she is the purveyor, perhaps the most visible, most noticeable purveyor of that Kremlin line in Russia. So I want to go back a little bit because I want to explain the context in which this disinformation and this type of Russian state TV narrative has grown, and specifically in relation to the current war in Ukraine. Like I said, I was in Ukraine for the first phase of this invasion back in 2014. And back then, you might remember, the narrative was that, well, there was no narrative at first because Crimea was part of Ukraine. The Donbass region, which is an industrial region in the east of Ukraine, was part of Ukraine. Yes, there were more ethnic Russian speakers, Russophones, as you'd say, in the eastern part of Ukraine. In the Donetsk region, in the Luhansk region, there were more Russian speakers. That is absolutely true. But whereas today, the narrative from Russian state TV is that all of those Russian speakers are terrified for their lives, are terrified that they are on the receiving end of an orchestrated genocide. And that is the word that Russian state TV often uses, a genocide by Ukrainian, remember, going back to the neo-Nazi language, against them. And I put this in my little blurb at the very beginning, the narrative line being that Russian speakers, try to follow this one, Russian speakers in the Donbass and the eastern Ukraine regions, those closest to the Russian border, who are living in Ukraine, are being genocided, are being killed, deliberately killed in an orchestrated scheme by neo-Nazi Ukrainians. It sounds outrageous when I say it, but that is the narrative that is pushed every single night. And I said to myself, well, how did this even begin? How does anyone even buy into that narrative? It just seems so ridiculous. And why wouldn't you even question it? I want to show you how it started in 2014. When I went there in February 2014, I flew into, with a crew from France24, we flew into Simferopol, which was at the time Ukraine. It wasn't, Simferopol is the capital of Crimea, okay? Crimean Peninsula. Simferopol to the south is Sevastopol. Sevastopol is the capital of the Black Sea Fleet, the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which is also a point of resentment because it was always based in Ukraine. Crimea was Ukraine. I flew into Ukraine. We were reporting from Ukraine. Why did we fly in there? We flew in there, and we could bring up, we flew in there. That is that was the Crimean parliament. As you can even see, that writing there, it says Verkhovna Rada, which is the Supreme Council, that's Ukrainian language. That was the Ukrainian, Crimea was Ukrainian territory. We flew in on the 25th. On the 26th, when I woke up, I noticed a Russian flag on the top of that building. Something had happened overnight. There had been a big protest the day before. What happened the day before is there were two opposing protests. You had, on the one hand, about 10,000 pro-Ukrainian protesters gathered along a big square in front of the parliament, and about 700 other people who were Russian speakers, and they were rather restive, to say the least. They were extremely volatile, and they were trying to stir things up. There weren't that many of them, but this was the big crowd. These were the pro-Ukrainians. That guy in the middle of the crowd, a lot of them were part of what's called the Mejlis. The Mejlis were Crimean Tatars. It says, "I am Russian and I want to live in Ukraine." It's a handwritten sign. Obviously, the guy came up with himself. What he was basically saying there is, yes, I'm Russian. Russian identity. I speak Russian. I'm ethnic Russian. But guess what? Ukraine's my country. I want to live in Ukraine. This is my country. And that was a widespread sentiment across the region. Very widespread sentiment. What happened was, though, overnight, there was an information war that essentially started. And what happened was these little green men showed up. You might remember the little green men. Let me see if I can find the little green men. Those are little green men in the background. That was the next day when they occupied the airport in Simferopol. They surrounded the airport. They just stood there. No one knew what was happening. They were soldiers in green camouflage uniforms with no insignia on them. They were Russian, but they would not acknowledge themselves as such. These are more little green men. Little green men in Crimea on the eve of the takeover of the parliament and of the airport, getting into a truck. I took this picture because we didn't know where they were going, and we followed the truck. We wanted to know where they were going and what was going on here. You could see there were other photographers around as well. A few days later, they ended up going to this base. It was a base called Perivalnaya, a little town, a little village, really, in the middle of nowhere, Crimea. Those soldiers standing there behind those gates are Ukrainian soldiers. It's a Ukrainian military base in Crimea. Those soldiers outside are little green men. What they started to do is they started to show up brigade-sized units of Russian soldiers. And for hours, they stood there. There was literally a standoff in front of those gates. No one knew what was going to happen. The Ukrainian soldiers, I tried to take a closer up picture. I don't know if I have it here. They ended up a few hours later leaving, walking out of the base because they knew they were outnumbered by the Russian troops. Their own commander couldn't bring in any reinforcements. They knew that they couldn't stand their ground in the base. They tried to as long as they could. It happened everywhere across Crimea. You had these so-called little green men, who I hated calling little green men because it fed into Putin's narrative. It was a cynical narrative. The little green men were nothing more than actual Russian soldiers who were wearing unconventional uniforms. In a lot of Russian shops, as Putin later said, you could just buy a green camouflage uniform. And there you were, you could be a little green man yourself. These were the types of signs that started to go up, that the Russian separatists, as we called them, the Russian separatists were often just Russians who were often sent from Russia to try to incite and to provoke and to stir up, to sow confusion, to sow dissent in the ranks. And a lot of these signs were calling for referendum, the junta, it says there, what looks like an XYHTA is junta von. So that's the Kiev junta. When you use junta, when they talk about that, that is the government in Kiev. Junta, get out. So these were all separatists, basically, and they put up these blockades. That's the flag of the Donetsk People's Republic, which now, since last year, has only been recognized by Russia. The Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, not recognized by anyone else, but these people basically imposed through an information war and through literally just showing up at rally after rally after rally, imposing their vision, if you will, and their will on the populations, the local populations here, who had never really thought in these very divisive ways. There hadn't been thoughts of Crimea seceding before this had happened. This is part of a deliberate plan. And it accelerated over the next few months. As you know, by May, Crimea was officially annexed. It was an annexation that to this day is not recognized by the international community. And what's interesting is at every step of the way, The disinformation was very savvy, because what happens, and this happens a lot on the Russian TV that I was showing you before, is the goal is to sow confusion, to sow doubt, to create multiple narratives. So many narratives sometimes that you end up sort of throwing up your hands. You say, I don't know what the truth is. There is no truth. I don't know what's going on. You make things so confusing. It's a subversion, if you will, of information. And this is the environment that a lot of Russians lived in. It's not that every Russian watching this believed in their heart of hearts that the regime in Kiev was a junta that was out to, a neo-Nazi junta out to kill them. But what you get when I would talk to a lot of these people, and I would try to say he was democratically elected by this percentage of Ukrainians. A lot of Russian speakers that we speak to here in Ukraine are very proud and happy to be Ukrainian, and they're also proud of their ethnic Russian identity. They can very easily live with the two. They're proud of it. It makes them richer in their identity. They would turn that right back on me. They'd say, yeah, that's what all of you Westerners say. And there's a both sidesism in this. They'll say, yeah, well, you blame us for this. Well, what about when you did this? They'll talk about the NATO bombing Libya or bombing Kosovo, so on and so forth. There's always a sort of throwing it back in your face. So what aboutism? What about a both sidesism? I call it false equivalency. It's false equivalency because it's bringing up a sort of irrelevant narrative and throwing it in your face in order to dismiss the reality that's happening before their eyes. And the reality that happened before their eyes is that this was a artificially orchestrated and artificially created takeover and occupation of Crimea, in the same way that the Russian Revolution was, in a sense, a very small event on a certain level that was artificially orchestrated by Lenin. It was almost like a staging of the Russian Revolution, and it became very quickly, the Bolsheviks were able to consolidate their power, and then that became what you call facts on the ground. These scenes were everywhere, throughout both Donetsk and Crimea. Once again, little green men. And I chose this picture that I took because it's very interesting. The children, a new generation of children are being indoctrinated, essentially. The school books are being rewritten. The Russian history is being rewritten, reframed in these regions. So the children, in a sense, are being co-opted into this narrative right now, into this new narrative, which is actually an old narrative, Putin's narrative right now. There's one more. This sign here, which was not a handwritten sign, which was a sign that was handed out by organizational directors of the pro-Russian rally outside the Crimean parliament. It says Ukraine, Russia, Belarus together. And that goes back to the theme that I showed you at the very beginning with Putin before that World Russian People's Congress. This great Russian people, the identity that Belarus doesn't exist, Ukraine doesn't exist. They all are one big nation. There was an ultra-nationalist named Vladimir Zhirinovsky. Some of you might have heard of him. He died recently. And he always said, Russia from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. And it was this notion, it was obviously the extreme version of this millennial notion in Russia that the true Russian people, the real identity, does stretch across that entire landmass. Putin wants to bring them back together. 2014, it was clearly signaled right there. Anyone who says they were shocked by the invasion, the 2022 invasion, that it came out of nowhere, no, there it is, right on that sign, right there. It was signaled clearly. All three together. Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, вместе, together. I'm going to cut short because I want to have time for questions, and I want to pose a question, and maybe some of you have some ideas about this. How do you counter virulent, potent, toxic disinformation? Here in the West, we have basically, in Europe, much of the US, channels like Russia Today are not broadcast anymore. Russia Today was also in France. There was an RT France in French. Russia Today has an Arabic channel as well. Arabic with about 85 million viewers last I saw. Russia Today broadcasts in the languages of the places in which it is based. It is the foreign language equivalent of the Russian state TV platforms that I've shown. So the Western media platforms, they've taken it off the air. Sputnik also. Sputnik was a very powerful online news platform, no longer accessible here in the West. So that's, okay, censorship, people say, crying foul. Protect ourselves from Russian disinformation and being infected by just basically banning it. The problem here is that that tends to consolidate and solidify Putin's argument. You see, they can't take the truth themselves. So our banning their disinformation in a weird way boomerangs back and ends up actually helping Putin in a perverse way, feeding into his own narrative. I personally do have a few ideas, and I'd be curious to hear some of your own. But one of the things I know is that, and I guess it's not just right now Putin's disinformation and Russian disinformation, but also in, say, in the US, where you have the MAGA movements, in Europe, where you have some very virulent far-right movements. It doesn't work when you just go up to someone in a confrontational stance and you say you're wrong. Insults don't work. You will just be seen as an elitist, someone who is above it all and can't, and doesn't want to hear other people's truths, doesn't want to listen. It's really hard to do, but I think that it's actually, the only way to actually get through to people is to do the bridge building, because there have been studies done. One of the people who did, who's spoken to people who've done this research, Cambridge Analytica was one of the companies that did this. Peter Pomerantsev, he's a Ukrainian-born journalist author. He moved to London as a child. He went back to Russia, worked there. He's written several books about propaganda. And one of the things that people have told him, people who know disinformation very well, is that people who believe Putin's narrative and people who believe, say, Trump's narrative, the MAGA people, they're not monolithic. It's not one big lump of people who all get them into a room, they all agree. They all have very different backgrounds, very different interests. They're coming at it from different angles. Often they all subscribe to the movement out of maybe a common resentment or anger or a sense of being left out. He suggests the best way to get to these people is to actually, on a one-on-one level, talk to people, listen to them, talk to them. It's empathy, it's compassion, but it also shows that you're not coming up to them in this sort of holier-than-thou stance, saying, you're wrong, I'm right, and here's why. That will only provoke and incite. People will be much more willing to listen to you if you listen to what they have to say, let them talk, and just ask them questions, not in a confrontational way, but ask them questions. It's painstaking work. Some people would say it's almost like proselytizing. It's almost like evangelical work. But it really does sort of take that, because I found in my own reporting, and I'll end with this, when I was reporting, say, in 2016 US presidential elections, I'd go through Pennsylvania, Ohio, speaking to people in red country and Trump country, MAGA country, people who are all voting Trump. When they were all together in a crowd, they'd start cursing out Hillary Clinton. They'd be talking about, she's the Antichrist, she's horrible, Trump's our savior, he's our champion. When I got these people one-on-one, and I started just talking to them, not even about politics, just started talking, having a conversation with them, they'd start to say things where you get a little bit of an in. You'd see that these are human beings too. They're much more complex than the reductionists, that you can simplify them down to, these idiotic, MAGA-loving, whatever. Same thing in Russia. A lot of these people, the Russians who embrace this disinformation, like I said, of an older generation, a lot of it come by it quite honestly. They grew up in very hard times. They never really had a sophisticated information culture. They grew up with often one source of information. When I used to travel in Russia, I'd often go to some factory towns. I'd report from somewhere. There was a radio in the room. There was only one channel. And the channel was whatever the factory radio station was. That was the culture they grew up in. And when you grow up with a certain identity, I think anyone can identify with this, relate to this. When you grow up with a certain identity and all of a sudden someone comes up to you, some elitist, I'll say in quotes, in a far off city, telling you everything you think is wrong, yeah, you're going to cling to your identity. You're going to get a little bit defensive about it. You're not going to just want to give it up overnight. You are, out of really self-protection, there's a psychological element in there as well. So I think part of the key is listening. I think part of the key is compassion. I think part of the key is getting off social media. I think part of the key is educating a new generation, children especially in schools, as Sweden, Finland, Estonia have begun doing. Educate children in how to recognize disinformation, how to distinguish between various types of information. Start at a very young age, the way you do with inculcating language. instill it at a young age. They don't really do it in the US yet. I don't know what Canada is. Maybe someone here could tell me. But I do think that starting young, education, teaching people what good information is, what reliable information is. Go to reliable information sources. You say, what is reliable? Yes, there are reliable information sources, more reliable than others. Not everything is corrupt. There's no such thing as absolute objectivity. We all know that. Everyone has a perspective. There is such a thing as being balanced and fair and honest and trying to actually report on a story from the perspective of wanting to get at the facts. Final thing is, when I was leaving Russia in 1995, when I'd been working there, the New York Times briefly started. This was the only time in Russian history, in the New York Times history, for a brief window, the New York Times published in Russian. It published twice weekly an edition which was a sort of synopsis of its best, compilation of its best articles, translated into Russian. It was sold on Russian newsstands. This shows how far Russia's come today. It was sold in Russia on Russian newsstands. And one night when I went for a vodka session at a friend's house, I brought a copy of the New York Times to my friend's father, who had worked all his life as a Soviet prosecutor in the Soviet justice system, grew up watching Vremya, state news, grew up thinking that all Americans were Satan and evil and out to get him. And he was a nice guy. We picked mushrooms together and did all sorts of stuff. Great guy. I said to him, I said, this is the paper from my hometown, New York City, that I've read for many years, and I think it's a good paper. I said, would you like to read it? And he was a little resistant. I said, no, he said, хорошо. He said, okay. And he took it, and I went back 2 weeks later, and he said to me, he was a very emotional man, like a lot of Russians are. And he'd had a little bit too much to drink, and his tears literally were in his eyes. He said, oh my God. He said, I finally realized that people have been lying to me all of my life. I know that sounds emotional, it sounds exaggerated. He literally said that. It was almost like an eye-opening experience for him. And it was like the scales fell off his eyes. It's an extreme example, but it does happen to a lot of people in similar situations. And I always think of that story today, because I just think that even the most hardened people who are most resistant to perhaps seeing things from a different way, when they are presented in a non-confrontational way with an alternative, and they're given the chance to see that, some of them, not all of them, will have a change of heart and a change of perspective. Thanks.